Welcome everybody to the next episode of the Cannabis Review. We had a little break there, but we're delighted to be back now, and we're talking all things cannabis education on this episode. We're delighted to be joined by Ryan McCreanor. He's the founder and CEO of Sativa Learning. Ryan, how are you keeping, mate?
Very well, Owen. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Thank you very much. We had a nice hot summer here over in Dublin, so we're back into the work now with everybody back off their holidays. Can you give everybody a little overview of how you got to where you are with Sativa Learning and your background and time in Canada?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose this is a fairly brief introduction to myself. So after university, I worked as a toxicology scientist, and the company I worked for created drug testing kits for drugs of abuse. And one of the panels I was involved with tested for synthetic cannabinoids, as well as cannabis, other prescription drugs, and designer drugs or street drugs. So that's kind of where I got my introduction to the world of toxicology. Did that for a few years, and then later went off traveling and ended up in Vancouver. And when I was in Vancouver, I worked for the government when just shortly after they legalized adult use or recreational cannabis in 2018. So I was on the phones taking calls from the public on everything to do with cannabis and educating around cannabis, and eventually moved into a training role where I would travel to retail stores across British Columbia and educate the cannabis consultants. And moved home back to Belfast, not too far away from you. I think it was end of 2019, and that's when I decided to set up Sativa Learning as an education platform for the cannabis industry.
Okay, amazing. So you've got a fair deal of experience already before you'd set up Sativa Learning and knowing exactly what to teach. Can we talk about the cannabis education worldwide? Like, we've got Amsterdam over the US, Leafly have their own 101 version. Everybody seems to have that little introductory module for everybody to get their grips around. Who do you see as having the best cannabis education at the moment? Is it Europe or is it North America?
I would say definitely North America. As you say, Amsterdam are probably one of the biggest leaders in the space. Green Flower Academy are also doing very well. And there's many others, there's Cannabis Training University, Trichome Institute. There's quite a lot of these platforms which are very successful in North America. And I don't think that a leader has emerged yet here. In the UK, even Europe and beyond, I think even Australia, New Zealand could do with a leader. I know there is one that started in South Africa. The name escapes me at the minute, but yes, we're seeing a lot of cannabis education platforms pop up at the minute. And I think if you look at what's happening in North America, colleges and universities are now starting to offer cannabis education programs, and some of them in conjunction with cannabis education platforms. So if you look at what the future of the cannabis industry is going to be like, it's my belief that it's going to be like any other industry, where you're going to need some form of formalized, credible training and education to secure a position within the industry. And I think if you're unfamiliar with the cannabis industry, you mightn't be too sure as to why that is. But if you look at the industry as a whole, from seed to, seed banks, genetics, cultivation, extraction, purification, product formulation, the retail side of things, operating a cannabis business, cannabis policy, there's so many avenues and aspects to the cannabis plant. And whether it's wellness, medical, recreational, or even if you're looking at the industrial hemp side, which is a whole other category as well, there is a need for credible, formalized training in the industry. So that's what we're trying to do with Sativa Learning. That's the reason it's been set up. When I returned home from Canada, I noticed there was a big gap in knowledge, especially in the CBD industry. So that's why we released a course on the CBD industry to provide a comprehensive overview for people trying to get a better understanding. And what we're going to do is just continue to add different courses. We're now working on a medical cannabis course with the Medical Cannabis Clinicians Society, in the hopes that we can start educating more clinicians on prescribing cannabis-based medicines.
Yeah, well, actually, we'll kind of move into the next topic now, since that you brought it up. It was educating medical professionals. This seems to be the hardest hurdle that a lot of people are having to overcome, is that there is no doctors who know what they're talking about generally, and none of them want to prescribe a medicine that they don't know what they're talking about. What's going to be the magic arrow that gets through to this? Is it going to be targeting a specific association of doctors and getting them all on board in one fell swoop? Is there going to be some super celebrity doctor that gets on board and a lot of them start to follow? What do you see happening over the next 6 to 12 months that'll help get the patients to access to the products that they need?
That's a hard one to answer. What's going to be there's so many factors involved in why medical professionals are not educated on cannabis-based medicines. So it's tricky to say. I mean, the main reason, as you touched on, is there's just a lack of education for them at the minute. I think anybody that's familiar with cannabis will know a little bit about the endocannabinoid system. So for anybody that doesn't know, it was only discovered in the 1990s, but it has yet to make its way into standard medical teaching, whether that's your continuing teaching as a medical professional or when you're a student in university. So I mean, it's a neurotransmitter system. Doctors will be familiar with the likes of the serotonin system, the dopamine system, the noradrenaline system. But the vast majority of medical professionals will have no understanding of the endocannabinoid system, and it's vital to our function. I'm sure you've heard of Dr. Ethan Rousseau. He's a world-renowned cannabis researcher, and he uses the prime example that there are more cannabinoid receptors in the brain than there are for all other neurotransmitters put together. So it has an overall role in memory, pain control, sleep, appetite, temperature control, immune response. And that's the reason why cannabis medicines can, benefit such a wide range of medical conditions. It would be similar to, a mechanic knowing nothing about the engine of a car. That's how important the endocannabinoid system is to our health. And we have endocannabinoids in the body that regulate that system. But when that system is not functioning optimally, we can introduce cannabinoids from cannabis to supplement that and help bring about homeostasis in the body. So that's one of the, I suppose the main one is the lack of education on the ECS. Then there's the issue of plant medicine versus, single compound pharmaceuticals, or more broadly, I suppose people will look at it as Eastern medicine versus Western medicine. So Western doctors have been conditioned to think about medicine in a certain way. And usually that's single compound drugs to combat a certain condition. But cannabis doesn't really fall into that category. So there needs to be a paradigm shift here. Cannabis contains hundreds of active compounds. It's a polypharmacy in itself. And there are over 140 cannabinoids. There are over 100 terpenes and 20 or more flavonoids that all interact. When ingested, they interact with each other synergistically to create an overall effect, which is known as the entourage effect. And doctors are just not comfortable with that at this stage. They have no training on botanical medicines. And a lot of that as well will be fear of the unknown for them. A doctor that's used to prescribing pills to a patient will be very uncomfortable with a patient vaporizing dried flower to get relief for chronic pain or whatever it happens to be. So those are a couple of issues. And then when it comes to the I suppose the research side of things, there is a lack of randomized controlled trials. which would be considered kind of the gold standard for single pharmaceutical compounds. And there are some for cannabis, and products like Epidiolex have made it to market through, clinical trials and RCTs. But cannabis does not lend itself very well to randomized controlled trials, again, because there are hundreds of active compounds which work together to give an overall effect. And due to that lack of RCTs, then there are very restrictive guidelines. So I'll use the example in the UK because I know a bit more about the UK guidelines than the Ireland ones, but NICE, they're the National Institute of Healthcare and Excellence. So they provide guidelines to the NHS for prescribing medicines. And their guidelines for cannabis are very restrictive because they have not looked at cannabis medicine as whole plant medicine. Rather, they've pushed it down the single compound route and only looked at RCTs, which there are not many of. When really they should be looking at real world evidence, case studies and observational data. So because the guidelines are so restrictive, even if a doctor was educated and willing to prescribe, it's not that it's frowned upon, it's just the guidelines are very restrictive for them to prescribe. So that's another issue there.
Okay, and you might know, actually, there was a couple of private clinics opened up in Manchester and London that were prescribing cannabis to its patients. How have they fared? And has that been a case of they've literally just gone and found a doctor and a nurse, trained them up on cannabis, and then they can open up their own practice to prescribe cannabis? Is it as simple as that?
I don't know about how I wouldn't know the ins and outs of actually setting up a clinic. What I do know is that you have to be on the GMC specialist register to prescribe cannabis. So the UK system is actually quite liberal in that you can prescribe for any condition. It's just not within the guidelines. It's not recommended in the guidelines, but there's they don't recommend against cannabis medicines, let's say. So at the minute, they have Epidiolex, Nabilone, and Sativex would be the approved prescription cannabis-based medicines. So if you want to prescribe an unlicensed cannabis medication like dried flower or a full spectrum oil, doctors will be hesitant to do so. But at the minute, the latest figures we have
available. Sorry to interrupt you there. So if a doctor did prescribe and say, look, I recommend dried flower, is that product available to a consumer in the UK at the moment?
Yes, at the moment it is. It's just considered an unlicensed medication. So that's why you have to be on the GMC specialist register to prescribe it. So there are patients currently receiving cannabis flower or cannabis oil. Again, they are unlicensed medications, but there are around 6,000 private prescriptions. So the problem is, private prescriptions, of course, are very expensive and unaffordable for most patients. But at the minute, those clinics have, I believe there's, last time I talked to Professor Barnes, around 60 to 70 medical cannabis clinicians currently prescribing in the UK. They have prescribed around 6,000 unlicensed cannabis medications, full spectrum medications, and there are only 3 NHS prescriptions in the UK, which is just shameful, really.
Yeah, that's a bit of a drastic ratio there, and I'd love to get the feedback in what negative connotations have happened to any of the patients of those 6,000. I'd be willing to bet a large sum of money that it's pretty much zero.
Yeah, absolutely. And the good thing is, there's the likes of Project 2021. I don't know if you've heard of that before, through Drug Science. So they're aiming to enroll 20,000 cannabis patients and create one of the largest bodies of evidence for medical cannabis. And that will be, real world evidence that they're providing there. So they are starting to release some of their findings from that. So it's good to keep an eye on that as well, to see how cannabis patients are getting on. And they've had some very positive results so far.
Amazing. So great. Very positive to hear. Fortunately, we hit our time here for this episode. I'd definitely love to have you back on and we can get into more detail and start talking about some CBD receptors and some other finer details. I don't know if you saw Peter Greenspoon's paper there in the Harvard Medical there the other week. It was very informative and there's lots to discuss there. But thank you a million for coming on the show, Ryan. It's much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you, Owen, and thanks for doing your bit to spread the word. And you've had some fantastic guests on, so I appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you very much, mate. It's very much appreciated. We'll chat to everybody in the next episode, and everybody have a good day. Cheers.